So on the basis of this incorrect evidence, we were told to start eating according to this food pyramid. And the foods that we traditionally eaten, the milk, the yogurt, the cheese, the meat, the poultry, the fish, the eggs, and the nuts, were made third-class citizens. And the cereals and grains were placed at the bottom of the pyramid, and we were told that we had to eat 6 to 11 servings a day of these foods. And then we were told that it was because they were much more nutritious for us. And that is completely wrong, because those cereals are based on grasses. That's what they traditionally are. They are simply grasses that have been bred to give us these cereals. To believe that a grass can have the same nutritional value as an egg, which is made of a whole animal, or a fish, or a liver, which is the powerhouse of our bodies and makes up all the nutrients that we need to survive, is completely ludicrous, but this is what we're told. So the reality is we took the nutrient-dense foods out of our diet and we replaced them with grasses which do not have the same nutrient value. And if you want to look at what these grasses actually contain, when we take those foodstuffs at the bottom and analyze them, and take them out of the diet and analyze exactly what they are, that's all they provide. They just provide glucose. So in a sense, instead of eating pasta, you might as well just buy a bag of glucose and eat it because it's the same effect. And what glucose does to your body is it raises your blood glucose and insulin concentrations dramatically. And there's growing evidence that that is not how humans are designed. We're not designed to cope with a flood of carbohydrate and glucose coming into the system. But even worse, we now know that carbohydrates is utterly unessential for humans. We have no requirement for carbohydrate. We do not need to eat 1 gram of carbohydrate a day to be healthy. And so we took the one macronutrient, carbohydrate, that our body does not need, and we said it must constitute 50 to 60% of our diet. It doesn't make sense, because carbohydrate can only do one of two things in your body. You either burn it as a fuel or you store it as fat. There's no other option. Now, do we know that carbohydrates are bad for us? And the answer is we've known that since 1825, when Jean Antoine Brillat-Savarin wrote the book, The Physiology of Taste. And he was the first to say that carbohydrates are fattening. So he said firstly that some people are destined to be fat, but he also said that the main cause of obesity is the fact that farinaceous, and that is starchy foods, is the basis of our daily food. We have already said that all animals that live on starchy foods become fat, and man obeys the common law. So that is written in 1825. And anyone who's a farmer knows that. How do you make mammals, the dairy, for example, fat? You feed them corn. How do you get livers fat in the ducks, for foie gras? You feed them corn. You don't feed them fat. And this is something that, for some strange reason, nutritionists and the medical profession simply can't understand, that we've known since 1825 that to make mammals fat, you feed them carbohydrates, particularly corn, and not fat. And so what he said in 1826 was, avoid everything starchy under whatever form it appears. You have yet the roast, salads, and herbaceous vegetables. So in 1826, he is describing Dr. Robert Atkins' diet, which is a diet high in roast, salads, and herbaceous vegetables. But he also was criticized, of course, because the people came and said how cruel the professor is, because he had once prescribed all we like, the white rolls, the biscuits, the cakes, and all the good things made with sugar, eggs, and farina. He will spare neither potatoes nor macaroni. Who would have expected it from a man fond of everything good? So here we have the first report in 1825 that carbohydrates make you fat. The next very famous book, and perhaps the most famous nutrition book ever written, was by William Banting, who was an obese undertaker in London, who for 30 years tried to treat his obesity, and he went to all the best doctors in Harley Street and all over Britain, and no one could help him, until he finally met Dr. Harvey, who told him that to get thin, he had to stop eating carbohydrate. And he lost all his extra weight and lived for another 20 or 30 years, and was so happy that with the outcome that he wrote this book and self-published it, and it became the most famous diet book of all time. And he said that you have to be careful because as you get older, you can't eat the same foods. And the items from which I was advised to abstain as much as possible were bread, butter, milk, sugar, beer, and potatoes. The butter and milk are wrong because it was not understood that butter and milk are not high in carbohydrate at the time, but it's now known that, of course, butter has little carbohydrate, milk actually has a substantial amount of carbohydrate and probably should be avoided for some people. So Banting continued, these, said my accident advisor, contain starch and saccharine matter tending to create fat and should be avoided altogether. So the most famous diet book ever, written in 1865, described how to get thin you had to avoid carbohydrates. And Banting made another really important point, and he said, I can confidently say that the quantity of the diet may be safely left to the natural appetite. What he's saying here is that you don't have to count calories or count portion size if you're eating the right quality of food, and by the quality he meant the macronutrient composition. So if you're eating foods which have high nutrient density, protein and fat particularly, you don't have to worry about counting calories because the brain will make the calculations for you. And so he said it's the quality of the food that determines whether or not you're lean or fat, not the quantity. And that was a major insight, which has really been written about by Robert Atkins again in the 1970s when he wrote his book, and others more recently. This was the book on which Banting's diet was based. And that book then, the idea then spread to Germany, and Wilhelm Epstein wrote the German edition and was the first doctor that I could find describing this low carbohydrate, high fat diet for the treatment of obesity. And that book is available in English, but it's out of print, but here was the original German edition. But more importantly, Sir William Osler, who was considered one of the greatest physicians of all time, in his Principles and Practices of Medicine, published in 1892, he says the following: many plans are now advised for the reduction of fat, the most important of which are those of Banting, who we've seen, Epstein we've seen, and Ortel, I haven't found him yet. In the Harvey-Banting method, the amount of food is reduced and liquids are restricted, and fats and carbohydrates are excluded. Now that's sad because the original Banting diet was high in fat. But Harvey eventually decided that he couldn't explain why a high carbohydrate diet made you fat, and whereas a high fat diet made you thin. And so he said it wasn't actually the fats in the diet that made you thin, it was avoiding the fats and the carbohydrates. And so he confused the issue and said actually it's a high protein diet that causes weight loss. But Banting never accepted that and said all his life that it was the high fat diet that explained why he had lost weight, and that it was only on the high fat diet that he could maintain his weight. Then we met Epstein, the German doctor, who recommends the use of fat and the rapid exclusion of carbohydrates. So Epstein got it right. He took the right Banting diet and promoted it in Europe. Farinaceous, i.e. starchy food, should be reduced to a minimum. Sugar should be entirely prohibited. First person saying that you shouldn't be eating any sugar. A moderate amount of fats for the reason given by Epstein should be allowed. Now this is the most famous textbook in medicine, and it's written in 1892, and it says you mustn't eat carbohydrates or sugar if you want to be thin. And so the very first diet books ever published assumed it's self-evident that carbohydrates cause obesity and carbohydrate restriction is the only treatment for obesity. So, and this is the point, diets for obesity that are not based on carbohydrate restriction can legitimately be labeled as fad diets. So the high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet is not the fad diet. The fad diet is the diet that we've been eating since 1977, which is high in carbohydrates and low in fat. And the sooner we get to realize that, the better for all our health. Vilgemor Stephenson was an American from New York who traveled through the Arctic and lived with the Inuit for 10 years, eating only seal, meat, and fish. And he came back to New York, and people said, it's impossible for you to live on that diet, you must have died, but he didn't die. So he said, well, let's do an experiment. And he went through a year-long experiment in New York, in which he was fed only fat and protein without any vegetables or carbohydrates. And he did extremely well. But the books that he wrote about his experiences brought the low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet to North America from where it spread. And since then, numerous books have been written about this low-carbohydrate eating plan. And these are books now from the 60s, the 60s, the 60s, the 70s. Dr. Atkins' book comes from the 70s. These books are now from the 80s and 90s, 2000, and more recently right up to 2010. So these are some of the books that have been written on low carbohydrate eating and eating more fat and protein in the diet. So it shows that there's an enormous amount of books have been written on this topic by many scientists who are not fringe, who are becoming more and more mainline. And the books that influenced me, of course, were Dr. Atkins' book. And Dr. Atkins was demonized because he came out in the 1970s saying we should be eating more fat at the very time that the dietary goals for Americans were saying that we should be eating less fat and more carbohydrate. The reality is that Dr. Atkins was a physician who treated tens of thousands of people with obesity and diabetes, and he cured many of them. And tragically, he didn't document exactly what the outcomes were of those patients. Had he invested more of his time into research, we wouldn't even be debating the issue of what diet you should be following, because he would have proven that his diet was superior. And then there are many publications in the scientific literature showing the benefits of this diet. And tragically, it is often said that there are no randomized controlled clinical trials in which we compare the high-fat to the low-fat diets. There are scores of these studies, well-documented, well-conducted studies. And these are just some of the articles from which they come, and they all show the same thing. And the conclusion is always the same, that the high-fat diet is at least as effective as a high-carbohydrate diet in reversing obesity and all the coronary risk factors. And my reading of those studies are that the more committed the people are in the study, the better the benefits they get from the very low carbohydrate diets. And in my view, the evidence is really clear that at least and certainly for some people who have this condition of insulin resistance, that the high-fat diet is markedly superior than any diet in which carbohydrates constitute a large percentage of the calories.